The following podcast is an Embassy Row production.
Hey everybody, I'm Marc Lamont Hill. I am the owner of Uncle Bobby's Coffee and Books. I am a professor, a scholar, but most importantly, I'm a book nerd. I say book nerd because I don't just love to read books, I'm the person who loves to read about the book. I love hearing authors talk about how and why they wrote the book, and I love talking to other book nerds about their favorite books. That's why I started Coffee and Books. It's a podcast all about books. Every episode, I sit down over a cup of coffee with the world's biggest authors to discuss the most interesting, controversial, fun, and important books. And sometimes I'll hang out with experts, fans, and other special guests to talk about some of the greatest books of all time. And this week, I am so excited to be joined by Stuart Stevens. He is a travel writer. He is a well-known political consultant, and he is the author of a new best-selling book called It Was All a Lie: How the Republican Party Became Donald Trump. Stuart, good to see you.
Thank you for having me, man.
So, Stuart, today I am drinking a cup of La Colombe straight black coffee. I've been doing some writing, and I find that black coffee just keeps me awake. You write both political pieces and you do travel diaries, so I'm sure you need to stay up. Is coffee part of your process?
Huge. Yes. I drink enough coffee to alter the outcome of the Super Bowl on any given day. You know, I'm a straight up espresso guy.
Really?
I drink a frightening amount of it. In fact, I once told the doctor, and they just looked at me and said, like, I really wish you hadn't told me that.
As a conservative consultant, I would have thought that espresso would have been too highbrow, too John Kerry, Volvo.
No, listen, I realized at a certain point in my life that I actually am everything that we accuse John Kerry of being. I'm effete, expensive bicycle loving guy who likes to windsurf. I mean, I was like,
well, I promise I won't.
Except I didn't marry a billionaire.
There you go. And I promise I won't Swiss boat you in this interview. But I do want to talk to you about this wonderful new book you wrote. And I want to start by talking about what it's not. You know, we're at a season right now where people are writing tell-alls about Donald Trump. Yep. They are from Mary Trump to John Bolton. We had Fire and Fury a year ago. People are writing a lot of books exposing Donald Trump. Your book talks about how we got to a moment of Donald Trump, how the Republican Party creates a pathway to allow for Donald Trump to exist. But this is not a tawdry tell-all. Why did you decide to go that route when the other route might have been more lucrative and more interesting?
Yeah, you know, I think something extraordinary has happened with a major American political party that's never happened before. And that is the embrace of Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. I don't think he's a black swan. I don't think he hijacked the party. So I think it's really, to me, I asked myself why I didn't see this sooner, why I didn't do more to stop the element of the party that became Trump, and just asked myself, how did this happen? To me, it was sort of like the guns of August. Like, you know, everybody said that they want World War I, but then it happened. How did it happen? And that was important to me to try to understand, you know, asking those questions. Only through writing it that I really felt like I could understand it, though I still can't say that I understand it completely, but I better understand it.
Talk to me about what your goal was for writing this book.
Well, you know, it really starts in 2016. A lot of people were wrong about Donald Trump, but it's hard to find anybody who was more wrong than me. You know, I didn't think he was going to win the primary, and I didn't think he was going to win the general. Now, in retrospect, a lot of that is because I didn't want to believe it. Because I'd worked in the Republican Party for, I don't know, almost 3 decades, and I didn't want to believe this party I'd worked in would accept Donald Trump. And then after Trump won, I went through this sort of phase, I think like a lot of my friends, well, Donald Trump isn't really the Republican Party. He hijacked the Republican Party. But I don't really know how you sustain that. I mean, he's incredibly popular in the Republican Party, and the Republican Party is the party that endorsed Roy Moore and attacked John Bolton. You kind of have to come to grips with that. So then I just found myself asking, like, how did this happen? And that's what led me to write the book. And, you know, what I came to realize is really there'd been this tension in the Republican Party that goes back to the 50s. And those of us who worked for President Bush and were for a more inclusive party, we felt, at least I felt, and I think most of us did, that we were inevitably going to win, that we were on the right side of history, as it were.
When you say win, you mean win what?
That we would be dominant in the party, and that the party, if nothing else because of political necessity, would become more expansive, would become more inclusive, would become to look more like America. And
it's funny you say that, because there will be many people who would argue, under the Bush administration, both H.W. Bush and also George W. Bush, his son, that because the party shrunk so much and so many, and became so sort of polarizing, that this had to be by design, that this had to be intentional. And in the book, you talk about this idea of the Republican Party becoming the party of white America.
Yep.
You're saying that wasn't the goal of the Republicans in the 80s and 90s.
I mean, if you look at George Bush, I think Governor Bush, when he ran in 99, you could make the case that conservatism was sort of a victim of its own success. So what do I mean by that? So Cold War had been a big issue. We'd won the Cold War more or less. Crime had been a big issue for conservatives. Crime was going down dramatically as it's continued to go down. Welfare had been a big issue for conservatives, and Bill Clinton famously ran on ending welfare as we knew it. So I think George Bush really asked himself, what is it to be a new conservative? And when he called himself a compassionate conservative, he got a lot of criticism from a lot of conservatives because saying, well, so look, are you saying that conservatism isn't compassionate? And George Bush's answer to that was, yeah, that's pretty much what I'm saying.
Right.
And, we need to change. So for him, the sort of portal into that change, I think, was education. I mean, he felt very passionately about education. He knew a lot about it. Whenever he was around kids, he would light up. So, we won the election, sort of, but let's say we won. And then what is the first big piece of legislation he passed was No Child Left Behind, which, was very bipartisan. There's that famous picture of him signing it with Ted Kennedy over his right shoulder. And, today that would be presented like a war crimes tribunal photograph or something, like evidence of conspiring with the enemy. So then he became a wartime president on 9/11. And I think in looking back, the ability of the party to become a different party probably ended on 9/11.
Let me ask you about that. So after 9/11, we see, of course, the Patriot Act. We see increasing levels of privatization, everything from Blackwater, in terms of privatization of military forces. We see the invasion of Iraq soon after. A wide range of domestic and foreign changes happen. Would you argue that post 9/11, the Republican Party was setting the stage for a Donald Trump?
I'm very conflicted on that, to be honest with you. I can argue that round or flat. So let me argue it both ways, and you can decide which one you think is the more credible, which is a question I ask myself. So on the one hand, George Bush really saw the need to expand the party. He got over 40% of Hispanic vote in 2004, which is the most any Republican nationally has ever gotten. He was willing to admit the faults of the party. Ken Melman, who was chairman of the Republican National Committee and who ran his 2004 campaign, went to the NAACP in 2005 and apologized for the Southern strategy, so-called, of the Republican Party. So you can look at that part. Then I look at another part. I think in 2004, frankly, what troubles me the most is we were for a constitutional amendment for same-sex marriage. And I think that's regrettable. Now, the issue was very different. In 2008, every presidential candidate was against same-sex marriage, Democrat and Republican. It's one of these incredible issues that now we don't even talk about it.
Right. I mean, Obama talked about his conflicts with it. I mean,
he was not for it in 2008. But I think that, if you go back and you look at how George Bush responded after 9/11, and you think about how Donald Trump would have responded. I mean, George Bush made a very significant point of trying to stop any hatred of Muslims in America. And, he spoke out that this is not a Muslim issue. It is an issue of those, we can't say that all Muslims are this way, which at the time seemed almost normal and what you would expect a president to do. But it's unimaginable now that Donald Trump would do that. So I think Iraq was a great tragedy. I mean, one of the great tragedies in American history. I'm of the opinion that George Bush didn't lie about this, and we could get into that if we want to, why I think that. I think it was a great mistake and a tragedy. But I think that George Bush, and you've seen it now, I think he is a good man. And you can argue, okay, does it matter if he's a good man or not? I think it does.
It may. I mean, for me, it would come down to what the policies are more so than what the person's individual character is. Although, to be sure, they certainly inform each other. But the ultimate impact on people is what's important to me. In the book, you talk about the various ways that the Republican Party has taken up issues that then ultimately led to the Trump moment. In other words, the Trump moment couldn't happen if the Republican Party hadn't taken particular choices. One of those issues is race.
Mm-hmm. I call race the original sin of the Republican Party.
How? Why is it that?
Well, so if you look at 1956, Dwight Eisenhower gets almost 40% of the African-American vote. Hell, Nixon got 32%, I think. I mean, Jackie Robertson campaigned for Nixon. And then with Barry Goldwater in 2004, he was against the Civil Rights Act, and it dropped to 7%. So you could have made a case at the time that, okay, once the Civil Rights Act passed, that African Americans would come back to the Republican Party in some numbers because of issues of shared values, be it patriotism, entrepreneurship, the role of faith in the public square. But it didn't happen. So 64, Goldwater gets 7%. Donald Trump gets between 7 and 8%. 60 years later, we haven't improved. And it's a great.
And how does race help us understand that story? So in 64, we have a public accommodations bill that's coming up that clearly, and as we see, the Constitution and the ideology of the Republican and Democratic parties are shifting. So it sort of stands to reason why Black folk may have said, you know what, we're going to side with the party that's going to give us access to the biggest public policy changes. But now, 60 years later, when those things aren't at stake in the same way, Trump is still getting those same numbers. Why?
I think because, there was working in Republican campaigns, there was this belief that the reason that we couldn't attract more African Americans is because we just didn't know how to talk to African Americans. That it was a communication issue, that we were mostly a bunch of white guys. And it created this little industry of African American consultants who would come and talk to Republican consultants and candidates about how better to communicate with African Americans, which was all very well intended, I think. But what I came to realize is I think African Americans understood what Republicans were saying perfectly. They just didn't like it. And I think that there was this, it wasn't like, because if you look at African American Republican candidates, they don't do much better with African Americans than white candidates. And you have to say, well, African Americans candidates, you can't say they don't know how to talk to African Americans. It doesn't make sense. So at the root of this was this fundamental tension. There was a joke that Ronald Reagan would tell that was also reflective of a broadly agreed upon Republican policy principle. And he would say in his speeches, the most dangerous words in the English language are, I'm from the federal government and I'm here to help. And it would always get a laugh. But how do you square that with those who looked at the federal government as one of the key, if not the key, tools for bettering their life? So how do you square that with, it was the federal government that sent troops to the University of Mississippi, my home state, to integrate Ole Miss? There was always that tension. And I think the Republican Party has never come to grips with the policies that they've advocated and the failure of the policies to attract more African Americans or more non-whites in general. And what's really interesting is, so if you look at it, so from 64, we've never gotten more than 10% of the African American vote, high watermark. So if you just think of the Republican Party as like a business, you spend all these years and like 90% of your market is one thing. You probably get good at talking to that market and not so good at talking to the other. So it sort of becomes a self-reinforcing trend. And I think the difference now is we used to admit that this was a failure and that we needed to change. And we talked about a big tent. Now, when's the last time you heard that phrase? And we don't even ever say it. So what Trump has done is taken that side of the party that was a white grievance side and validated it and said that this is really who the Republican Party is. And whenever I talk to Republican friends about Trump being a racist, almost invariably they go, well, look, Stuart, dude, are you telling me that the 63 million or so people voted for Trump, they're all racist? So what I always say is, well, first of all, there probably are 63 million racists in America, so let's don't get so, shocked here. But I think that you don't have to be a racist to vote for Donald Trump, but you have to be willing to admit that him being a racist is less important to you than other issues. And
Is it possible to have that perspective and not be racist?
Well, that's a profound question. I would argue not. I grew up in the South, and I knew a lot of people that they were really decent people. They wouldn't have used a slur to describe African Americans. They wouldn't have done anything mean, but they were segregationists. And the difference between the good segregationists and the bad segregationists didn't seem very far apart at the end of the day. And that's how I look at Trump. I look at him as segregation. And so these Republicans who say, well, there's a lot of things I don't like about Trump, but I support him. I'm reminded of George Wallace. George Wallace actually did some good stuff as governor. He passed free textbooks for public schools. But nobody's remembered as the free textbook George Wallace guy. You're just a George Wallace guy. Right. And I think that's how Donald Trump's going to be. You're not going to be, well, I'm the Donald Trump who cut taxes for marginal tax rates for corporations guy. I'm not the Donald Trump guy that called Mexicans rapists or, said there's good people on both sides when you're talking about, neo-Nazis.
Yeah.
I don't think you get that choice.
No.
I think to me, Trump is the moral test that the Republican Party failed.
Okay, I want to set up that word morals because it comes up in your book a few times. And you said something that I thought was interesting. You said, when pundits marvel that the Republican Party could accept a man like Donald Trump, who has 5 kids from 3 wives and talks in public about having sex with his daughter, they're missing the point. Trump doesn't signal a lowering of standards of morality by Republican voters. Instead, he gives them a chance to prove how little they have always cared about those issues. Trump just removes the necessity of pretending. Family values was never a set of morals or values that the Republican Party really desired to live by. Instead, family values was useful in attacking and defining Democrats. It was just another weapon to help portray those on the other side as being out of the mythical American mainstream. That's a heck of a thing to claim to make for a party that has prided itself.
I know.
On being the generous read has always been, they're wrong, but they believe what they're saying, right? They do care about values. They just have the wrong values, or they believe in morals. They just have a narrow idea of what morality is. But you're saying, no, this has all been a scam almost. They don't even believe in this stuff.
It was all a lie. This book wasn't a fun book to write, to be honest, because this isn't stuff that I would like to I didn't really ever want to come to grips with. But I don't know how else you can conclude. What is the essence of Christianity? Is kindness, caring for others. What is the essence of Donald Trump? It's a cruelty. And the use of religion for racial prejudice in America is a huge part of it. And there's been these figures that strangely resemble a lot like Donald Trump, like Jimmy Schweikert, the evangelical leader. He even kind of looks like Donald Trump. These sort of larger than life figures that kind of heavily painted and plastic surgery'd up. Now, look, like anything, it's a broad generalization, and there's some that do, but I don't see how you sustain that. If you go back and you look at this stuff that was written about Bill Clinton during the Monica Lewinsky stuff, like William Bennett, who was former education secretary, he wrote beautiful passages about how culture is the soul of a nation and how it's more important than any one issue. It's beautiful stuff. And now he supports Donald Trump. So It's like, man, those are really good sentences, but I just don't believe a word of it. Whereas, I felt that way about Bill Clinton. And I feel that way about Donald Trump.
Do you see Bill Clinton and Donald Trump as of the same sort?
No, not at all. But I think that I think that there was a lowering of standards of being a president. I think Bill Clinton was a sexual predator in a way. The idea that he would, this power differential between him and Monica Lewinsky, It just always struck me, I mean, even before the Me Too movement, it just always seemed so wrong to me. And, the irony is, I think if Democrats had more or less forced Clinton to resign, Al Gore would have become president. And I don't see any way that Al Gore wouldn't have been elected president in 2000. It's just kind of a fascinating alternative history. I think it's the same, which probably would have been better for the Democratic Party. I think it's the same with Republicans. If Republicans had opposed Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton had been elected president, at least then you could be an opposition party that stood for something. There's a noble role for that.
A Republican would say, isn't it more noble to win? To be able to actually control the future of the nation?
Well, what I always thought, we used to have this saying that if you only stood for election, you didn't stand for anything. And I actually believe that. Maybe
that's why you're not a major political consultant for these victorious candidates. And I don't mean that as criticism or as a dig. I mean, you're clearly articulating a kind of moral and ethical standard that other folk aren't living up to. Well, let me ask you, what is the long con?
Well, I think it's a number of things. It's sort of putting out beliefs that you don't really believe, like the deficit. Republicans say that they really care about the deficit, yet the deficit goes up more under Republicans than Democrats. I mean, that's just a fact. And look at Donald Trump. I mean, we don't even talk about the deficit anymore. I mean, it was just sort of like it was a con. And I think the same about a lot of issues of national defense. I mean, how is it that you can say that you really support patriotism and national defense when you have a president who won't stand up to Putin, who attacked John McCain? What I thought were values turned out to be marketing slogans. And, I would have said back in the dark ages, say 4 years ago, that there was a handful of beliefs that Republicans would agree on, 90% of them or so. So what were they? They were character counts. Character was really important. Personal responsibility was really important. The deficit, fiscal sanity was really important. Strong on Russia, standing up to dictators. Free trade. Pro-legal immigration. Avidly pro-legal immigration. Ronald Reagan announced in front of the Statue of Liberty, for crying out loud. He signed a bill in 1987 that made everybody in the country before 1983 legal. So it's not like the party now is has drifted away from these things, because sometimes parties do that. They're against all those things. Now we say, character, what does it matter? We're not voting for a preacher. What does it matter what Donald Trump is like? We say...
now, of course, though, I mean, we don't want to be nostalgic. It's not that previous presidents were necessarily made better choices. We just have greater access to those choices, right? I mean, if we were to put a window into the Reagan White House or the Kennedy White House.
It's true, but there was still a national belief that character counted. John Kennedy was a war hero. Profiles in courage, that was character. Now, he also had this side of him. He was sort of a sexual predator, too. But still, you would say character counts.
I don't know if he's a predator, but certainly promiscuous.
Well, yes, okay. Although, apparently, he did sleep with this intern, which is an incredible book she wrote, finally.
I hadn't read the book, so I'm not dismissing that as a legitimate position.
No, but
I was simply basing it on the history that we have access to.
Yeah, but there's no way you could still maintain that character was really important. I mean, he was a man of character. With Donald Trump, it's across the board. It's not just the sexual stuff. It's the attacking John McCain. It's the mocking our war heroes that we're doing now. It's his business practices. It's across the board. It's not just that, he's like a French president that has a mistress and we all kind of look the other way. No, it's a complete, he's a pathological liar, as Ted Cruz said. He attacked Ted Cruz's wife for being unattractive. And now Ted Cruz supports him.
Before Ted Cruz supported him.
It's just unbelievable to me. And we say, well, that stuff doesn't matter. I think we were right. We say personal responsibility. I mean, Donald Trump, nothing is ever Donald Trump's fault.
We would agree on that. The question, though, for some people would be, is this a case of the Republican Party moving in the wrong direction and throwing their hands up? Or is this a case of the Republican Party being completely sneak attacked by a Trump campaign that they didn't see coming? I mean, I remember Bobby Jindal remember even before the autopsy, right? When he's asked, will you endorse Trump? And he's like, he's not going to win. So, and they're like, yeah, but if he does, will you endorse him? he's not going to win. And this became the mantra. And obviously he was punting a little bit, but I think he genuinely didn't believe that he was going to win. Part of why Trump ended up with this kind of bizarro mix of spokespeople and pundits was because all the real ones were going to the candidates they thought could win. They went to Jeb Bush. The risk takers went to Ted Cruz, but no one went to Trump. That was. I mean, you don't get a Kelly McEnany, or Jeffrey Lord unless you have a bunch of
Corey Lewandowski.
Perfect example, right? Because the other folk of the world weren't going near Trump because he wasn't foreseeable to them.
Yeah, listen, Trump has always benefited from the inability to imagine Donald Trump. And I mean, I think you're exactly right. So if you go back to the primary, these other 15 candidates spent the entire time killing each other because all they wanted to do was be one-on-one with Donald Trump. Because Donald Trump, I mean, look.
They beat him.
Guys, the Republican Party's not going to nominate a failed casino owner who talks in public about having sex with his daughter. Like, that's just not going to happen. All I got to do is be one-on-one with this guy, and I'm going to beat his ass. So it was wrong. So after Trump got the nomination, I tried, and I write a little bit about this in the book, to get prominent Republicans in a few states to run against him as favorite sons, to just suck some votes away from him. I mean, if you took 3 points out of him in Florida, he couldn't win. 3 points out of him in Pennsylvania. And everybody I went to, and I went to them with agreed confidentiality, so I can't talk about it, they all said, look, Stuart, if we, the establishment, put our thumb on the scales and Trump loses, we'll get blamed for it. It'll be because of kind of trickery. It won't be because he's a racist. It won't be because he has terrible ideas. It won't be because they're alt-right. We just have to lose, let this wash out and rebuild. Kind of what Jindal would have been saying, he's not going to win.
Exactly.
So then I would always say, okay, I get that, but what if he wins? And they'll say, he's not going to win. And I didn't think he was going to win, so I probably wasn't very good at arguing the other, because it's ultimately what I believed. So then he wins, and the Republican Party just collapsed. I mean, after you saw it after the Access Hollywood tape, you had Republicans saying, okay, I'm not going to vote for Donald Trump. Republican leaders, I'm going to vote for, Mike Pence. It's like, really? I mean, that's like getting on a plane and saying, look, I'm not where the first 10 rows are going, but I'm for where the second 10 rows are going. It's like, dude, I'm thinking the plane is landing in the same place, and you're either getting on the plane or you're not. Don't give me this stuff. I don't get it. So you ask yourself, do people abandon deeply held beliefs in 2 years, 3 years? I don't think they do. I think the only conclusion you can come to is they didn't deeply hold these beliefs. They weren't important.
And not that they're being pragmatic, not that they're saying, hey, we lost, but we don't like Clinton's values. We don't like Obama's values. We're Republicans, we're conservative, and we'll take what we can get.
But did they really get anything that was conservative? I mean, look at it. What the deficit's out of control. We're, Putin's poodles. They say you're going to get conservative judges. Okay, really? So we have a president who attacks the rule of law, the most fundamental conservative principle imaginable. He attacks jurors. He attacks judges. I think that's a lot more damaging than, or more important than whether or not this judge or that judge is going to be appointed on a circuit. I think they're all excuses. I think it's looking for rationalizations. I mean, but look, COVID-19. So this confluence of trends in the Republican Party, Bobby Jindal also said, let's don't be the stupid party. And, but we became the stupid party. We became the anti-science party. We became the anti-expert party. We continued the trend that the federal government couldn't be a huge problem solver. So you put all that together, and what do you get? 180,000 Americans dead. And, we're headed to 400,000. I mean, if America had the same death rate from COVID as Germany, 140,000 more Americans would be alive.
Wow.
I mean, it's mind-boggling.
That's terrifying.
And it's terrifying. And nobody, I mean, so they're still quiet. They're still quiet when Donald Trump is saying, you should drink bleach. I gave up. What are you going to take? I mean, he's killing people. So my only conclusion is they have to lose. And they're not going to be motivated by any principles.
Is that the only thing that can save what you would probably call the soul of the Republican Party, is for Trump to just lose?
I think the Republican Party has to be burnt to the ground and just start over. And I think it's always hard when you're in the middle of a moment to understand what that moment is. But I don't think we've ever seen a complete collapse of a party like the Republican Party has collapsed. And to me, the only thing comparable is like the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union, where finally, you watch Chernobyl or something, the party said it believed and what happened was just so different that it just collapsed. I think that's what's happened to the Republican Party. And I think we're in for a period of center-left government. And eventually, it'll probably go too far. And eventually, some sane conservative alternative will emerge. But I mean, I just say this, if somebody held a gun to my head and said, look, tell me what conservatives really believe, I'd say, shoot me. I have no idea. I mean, what is it? I have no idea. Now, you take Elizabeth Warren, for instance. She can articulate a theory of government. You can love it, you can hate it, but she has a theory of government that's defensible. And it's coherent. I don't know anybody that can say the same for conservatives with any credibility. I mean, what is it? I don't know.
Sometimes for me, writing is not just a form of expression, it's a form of inquiry that
yes,
as you write, you learn, you study, you reflect. Has writing this book made you reconsider your own political ideology?
Yeah, very, very much so, yeah.
Where'd you land?
Well, I went back and I looked to go back to the Bush era. There was a body of work that supported the idea of compassionate conservatism, certain elements of it. Meyer Magnuson wrote this book, The Dream and the Nightmare, that I remember reading. In fact, when I got down to the Bush campaign in April of 99, I was handed the book and said, read this. This is really what the governor believes. And I read it and I thought I agreed with it all. And then I went back and reread it. And he really is blaming culture for poverty, not saying that really people who are poor are because of all this stuff we've heard so many times, because in the African-American community or other communities, there's lack of strong father figures.
Right.
And this is why,
the desire for delayed gratification and all
and that, it was a combination of if it feels good sort of white 60s culture combined with this. And this is really why the Great Society failed to the degree that it did fail, why we have housing projects. And I read that now and I go, well, that's total bullshit. It completely ignores the reality of the world.
Right. Systems and structures.
Exactly. And we have tremendous data to back that up. And I sort of read it and go, how did I believe this? I mean, why did I believe this? And once you believe that, it kind of leads you down a train of thought that has public policy ramifications. Look, I mean, when Ronald Reagan went to the Neshoba County Fair in Mississippi to sort of kick off his 1980 campaign, a lot of people, he talked about states' rights, that Neshoba County is where the 3 civil rights workers, Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman, were murdered and put in a dam. And a lot of people said at the time, this was racist of Ronald Reagan, that it was appealing to a racist. I always defended it, to be honest. So Mississippi was a swing state. Jimmy Carter carried Mississippi. We tend to forget that. So he wasn't going there just to wave the bloody shirt. And he carried Mississippi very narrowly. But now when I go back and I read that speech, it's not so much what he said, though he did reference states' rights. It's, you're in 1980. In 1963, 3 civil rights workers were, murdered and put in a dam, and you could almost walk from where you're speaking to where that happened, and you don't talk about it.
Yeah.
And that's wrong. I see it differently. And
does that mean that the next book is going to be Confessions of a Converted Liberal?
Well, I think a lot of conservatism just proved to be really phony. And I think that's one of the reasons the Republican Party is increasingly irrelevant in public policy debates. So, I mean, there's so many misconceptions, the whole attack of conservatives on welfare recipients. So what are the real welfare recipients? They're states like Mississippi, where I grew up, Alabama, Louisiana, these states that if they didn't get money from the federal government, which nothing but welfare, because their own tax dollars, they get 3-4 tax dollars back for every dollar they pay. Yeah. I mean, 40% of the Mississippi budget is paid by the federal government because people in California and New York make money that, and they get less money back. So that to me, the real welfare states are these states. They're the, if you're against welfare, you're for these states to, like South Carolina. Lindsey Graham talks about welfare. It's like, well, what about South Carolina, dude? So if you really believe this, you're going to say, okay, we don't want any money from the federal government. We're just going to stand on our own. Self-reliant. Isn't that what you're supposed to do? So it's a total fraud.
Let me ask you a question about that, because you talk about this idea of Republicans sort of faking a position in order to achieve a particular type of gain, and then they just pivot whenever they need to. The cynical reader of you, the critic of you, is going to say that he's the guy that stayed with the conservatives and he did conservative/Republican stuff when it was good for business, and now that it's bad for business, he's simply selling high, getting out, and tearing them down. That this is another cynical money grab, no different than what he's accusing the Republican Party of doing. What do you say to that person?
Well, the flaw of that is, well, first of all, there's a lot of truth to that, so I wouldn't necessarily. I mean, I think that's a fair criticism. Okay, but the flaw in that is, what do we know about Donald Trump? He's the most transactional person in the world. I could go on television today, and I've even thought about doing this as a little social science experiment, but I can't bring myself to do it. And if I praised Donald Trump, and I said, look, I got this wrong about the guy, and I get it now. Within 2 weeks, I could be working for the Donald Trump campaign and making a fortune. He's the most transactional guy in the world. He doesn't care what you said. You're for me now? Great, terrific. I had a political consulting firm. I started in the early 90s. I have this contradiction because, the people I work for, I liked. And they're good people, I'd say. If they lived next door to you, they'd be really good neighbors. If they saw you broken down on the road, they'd stop in a heartbeat. And yet they support Donald Trump. And so I left the firm because I really couldn't support candidates running for federal office who were Republicans. I don't know. I mean, I've said before, I probably represent the worst of the American political system because I was just into campaigns. I was into winning. And, I wasn't a government guy. Now, to my credit, I never tried to be. I never went into government. I think I would have been, terrible at it. Some people can be good at both. I think David Axelrod was. I think actually Karl Rove was. I think I would have been terrible. But I write about this, I became sort of enthralled with winning. And the way I kind of justified it was, what do lawyers say? Everybody deserves a defense. I don't want to know if the client's guilty or not. My role to support the American legal system is to give that person the best defense I can. And we'll let the courts decide. So in a way, you can say the same about political consulting. Let the voters decide. I mean, I don't tell them what to do. My role, I get hired by somebody.
No, that's exactly what political consultants do. They literally tell voters, vote for me. They literally tell voters what to do.
You can't make them anymore. Well, so do defense attorneys say, acquit my guy.
Right, with the zealous defense based on upholding a grander principle, right? That at the very least, I'm going to offer zealous defense, and that the goal isn't to defend their character, but to simply say, if there's reasonable doubt, we want to sustain a system that allows for that. If I'm defending Trump, I'm actually doing my best to convince the American people that someone who does not deserve that kind of vote, someone who's going to do harm.
Well, but see, what they would say is sort of a lot of these Trump people, they don't even try to defend him on his character. They say kind of what you said. It's about public policy. So let's look at the policy that Trump does.
Gotcha.
So, you don't have to like him as a person. But look, I think it's a bullshit analogy, so I'm not going to defend it here.
Let's not drill down on that, because before you go, there's a couple other things that I need to ask you. You have one of the most bizarre moonlighting jobs. I don't know if I can call it moonlighting, right? I mean, you're a major political consultant. You're also a major travel writer. In addition to this book, you've written a bunch of other books. I believe 7 other books, but it's not the political ones that interest me. You wrote The Big Enchilada campaign adventure with a cockeyed optimist from Texas who won the biggest prize in politics. That sort of made sense to me. But when I see that you wrote Malaria Dreams, an African adventure, you wrote Feeding Frenzy across Europe in search of the perfect meal. You wrote Night Train to Turkestan, Modern Adventures Along China's Ancient Silk Road. You are a conservative political operative / consultant, and you are a travel writer.
Yep.
How does that happen?
So I grew up in Mississippi, and there was this phrase that was coined by a University of Mississippi professor: "The Mississippi was behind the Magnolia Curtain." So I always had this sense that there was this larger world out there, and I was just desperate to get in that world. And to just experience this. So I fell in love with travel writing as a genre. And I always wanted to do it. I had sort of three interests in my life: politics, film, and writing. And I've been one of these dead lucky, and lucky is 90% of it, guys, that's been able to get paid to do what I liked. So I found out I could write travel books and I could take these trips and someone would actually pay me to do this. Not a lot of money, but I could justify it. And it's still a genre I'd like to do. I wanted to write as my next book. I wanted to drive across northern Russia into Siberia, all the way across. But I don't know with COVID now. I mean, well, first of all, we're Americans and we can't even leave the country.
Right. Well,
right.
If you put up maybe Trump bumper stickers on your car, you'll probably be safe there.
Oh, man, I wonder. That's one of the things I wonder. It's really
your sociological experiments.
Yeah, exactly. But so I've always had this rush to experience things. I like doing extreme sports, crazy sports. I suck at them all, but I like doing them. And I like writing. I was one of those kids who kind of grew up in libraries. It was a place I went and I felt the most comfortable.
Who do you read?
Oh, listen, man, I'll read the back of milk cartons. I'll read anything. I lately have been, one of the things I liked about this book was it gave me an excuse to read a lot of books. And the Republican Party is not an obscure subject. It's been, and there's unbelievable work that's been done. A lot of things I learned, like this beautiful book called Messengers on the Right, which traces the whole history of right-wing media by this woman, Nicole Himmer. But lately, I have been reading a lot about Germany in the 30s and about World War II. And there's an incredible collection of work, first-person accounts by Russian and German soldiers. And I've been reading a lot of those, like first-person accounts of Stalingrad and person accounts from the Russians, which there weren't many by the Russians. And I mean, look, everybody says, you can't talk about World War II and American politics because it's Hitler and it's, I disagree with that totally. I think you have to look at it because I think what happened in Germany in the 30s is much as what's happened with the Republican Party. It's not the same. We're going to have the same result. We have a stronger system.
No, but the rise of fascism and
the rationale that people use, like we were talking about, that there was a necessity to support Trump because the alternative was so dire. That's exactly what these German aristocrats said about Hitler. And if you read this incredible memoir, which you can actually get on Kindle, which blows my mind, by Franz von Papen, who was a German politician, aristocratic Prussian, who really allowed Hitler really to come into power more than anyone else. In 1953, he wrote a memoir, and he's still trying to justify it. Like, he basically says, a few things went wrong, okay? 20 million people died with the whole world. But you have to understand that given the choices that we faced, that Germany would have become a Bolshevik state, that we needed Hitler to stop that. Which basically, if you go back and you read the stuff that people wrote before, like the Flight 93 election that was written that, Donald Trump was what stopped. Well, it's what they're saying now. Donald Trump is our defense of Western civilization. It's so similar.
Eerily
similar. Yeah.
That's a great point. You talked about writing. What's your writing process?
I write best when I'm only writing. I just get lost in it.
Is that an everyday thing? Is that like a
Yeah. I have to write every day. Yeah. I try to write 1,000 words a day.
Really?
Yeah.
Now, is that 1,000 good words, or do you just write and then edit later? I know when in your
write and edit later.
For this book, you talked about kind of dumping out a really, really ugly first draft and then sending it to an editor. Is that? Are you less of an?
I self-edit a lot. I basically try to write in the morning and edit in the afternoon.
Okay.
And I really try to shut out the world. I've discovered that if you tell people you're writing a book, it's a good excuse not to do things. Somehow legit, they go there's supposed to be this family thing, or, I'd love to, but I'm writing this book, and it kind of gets you off the hook.
I'll remember that. It doesn't seem to work for me as well, but I find that people don't care if I'm writing a book. But I got to sell it better the way you do. I got to use some of those conservative sales skills, man, to get people to believe it.
I write best when I can become totally immersed. So I'm writing this novel now. I'm almost finished with it. Set in the first 3 months, 1968, about civil rights workers, mainly white civil rights workers in Mississippi and in Memphis. And that first 3 months of 1968 is a fascinating period. I mean, this is the garbage strike that led to the assassination of King, the Tet Offensive, all this incredible music out of Memphis. So I basically, while working on this, just immersed myself in that period. And there's great oral histories of civil rights workers, and to really try to just live in that space, to listen to that music, to read, to hear these voices. What I have trouble with now, I'm doing this Lincoln Project thing, and I really need to multitask. And I find that a lot harder. I kind of can't live in this fantasy world because I have to live in the moment of following what stupid thing Donald Trump just said so we can make an ad about it. And that's harder for me.
So you said you'll read anything and you love to write. So this will provide you with sufficient torture. I am sending you to a desert island. You can have 3 books and only 3 books, which you will have to read for the rest of your life. What are the 3 books?
Okay, that's a great question. One would be A Short Walk in the Hindu Kush by Eric Newby, who was really the first travel writer I fell in love with. Eric Newby was a guy, he grew up in a family that was in the dress business in the England in the 40s and 50s. He sort of hated it. He had a friend who was in the Foreign Service stationed abroad, and they started corresponding, and they hatched this plot to quit their jobs and climb the highest mountain in Afghanistan. And they both pretended that they knew what they were doing. And then finally, they quit their jobs and they got together in England and got drunk. And they both admitted to them, neither one of them had any idea how to climb a mountain. So they took this weekend. They both were like machoing out to the other, And so they took a weekend climbing course in Wales. And then they drove and they wrote this. He wrote a book about, they tried to climb the highest mountains in Afghanistan. And it has this wonderfully ironic title, A Short Walk in the Hindu Kush.
Nice. Travel writing is, you're the first person who's mentioned travel writing as a book to bring in such a situation. What's your second book?
News from Tartary. So News from Tartary is by Peter Fleming. Peter Fleming's a fascinating guy. In the 20s and 30s, Peter Fleming was famous in England. He was considered like the best looking guy in England. He married the most famous actress. He was a London poetry editor of The Spectator. It was the most effete job imaginable. So the London Times used to run this advertisement, want ads, called the Agony section, where people would advertise for people to go on expeditions. This is where Shackleton advertised for people to go to the South Pole for him. So he answered an ad to go to Brazil to look for a lost explorer. A British explorer had disappeared and hadn't been heard from in 20 years. So he answered it, and to his amazement, they accepted him. And then he got on this, and he assumed everyone else would know what they were doing, and they didn't. They were all a bunch of like British intellectuals and effetes. So he went on this, and he wrote a book about it. And then while he was waiting for that book to come out, he took a trip from Beijing all the way across China.
Turkestan, right?
Through Turkestan into Kashmir. So when he finished that journey, his book on Brazil had been published, and he was like famous and celebrated in England. And he wrote a book about that second trip, which is the trip that I retraced when I wrote Night Train to Turkestan.
I was going to ask if that was the influence, News from Tartary.
Yeah, I retraced his book. And what's fascinating is he traveled with a woman named Ella Mayart. She wrote a book. And if you read their 2 books, it's like they were on different trips. And they literally were like sleeping in the same.
That is a very common experience.
It's fascinating. But here's the thing about Peter Fleming. So he had this older brother who was like a total screw up, always getting in trouble, big alcoholic. And finally, he was a Reuters wire correspondent, a kind of low-down journalism job. Finally, in his 40s, in a last-ditch attempt to compete with his famous dashing brother, he sat down to write a thriller, and that was Ian Fleming, who wrote James Bond.
Oh, shit. Wow.
So now no one remembers Peter Fleming.
I was going to say, he's like a footnote now.
It's like a footnote in Ian Fleming's life, when he had this brother. And it's one of like life's incredible ironies.
God, who would have imagined?
And then I think as a third book, I would probably bring maybe Sophie's Choice.
Ironically. Wow. So
only because if you had 3 books to read, I find I can't read more than 3 pages of that book at once. I mean, it just
you can pace yourself.
Rips your heart out.
Yeah, a classic book. I was surprised that with the idea that if sent to a desert island where you couldn't leave, you'd want to read travel diaries. I mean, there's something. I think you like torturing yourself. It's like being a thoughtful.
That would be. I mean, you would get to travel in your mind.
That's true.
You would get to leave, and that would be I'd be like that kid in Mississippi sitting in a library reading about these places that I couldn't imagine. Wow. And wanted to go.
What a beautiful thought. And that's the beauty of books, and that's the beauty of ideas, man. Well, thank you for sharing your ideas and talking.
No, thank you. It's great.
How can people get a hold of you? You're on social media, right?
I'm on Twitter, God help me. Stuart P. Stevens, all one word, Stuart P. Stevens on Twitter.
All right, and it's Stevens.
Stevens, yeah.
Right, Stuart P. Stevens, the @ at Twitter. Stuart, thanks so much for hanging out with us.
Listen, buddy, thank you. This is great. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to Coffee and Books. Make sure you follow us on Instagram with the handle Coffee and Books Show. Also, you can buy all the books that have been discussed here on bookshop.org/Uncle Bobby's, or you can go to UncleBobby's.com. That's Uncle BOBBIES.com.